Greetings, good afternoon, good day, good morning, good night, whatever is relevant where you are on this planet, which is wrapped in a pandemic now, which is warming because of greenhouse gases, which is seeing the great acceleration play out. The human surge in the last couple of hundred years has been remarkable and cresting right now in ways that are deeply problematic and can maybe offer us some pathways forward. And history, is a really valuable starting point in this area. So I've invited Scott Knowles, who's at Drexel University, and who has his own podcast, his own webcast, his own. It's kind of both, right, Scott?
Right.
To join me, and he's been doing yeoman's work. Not only does he study disaster history and how people chronicle disasters and how that relates to how we do or don't respond to them well. But he's been holding a daily conversation, COVID calls, which you can see in the scrolling banner here. There's the link to get to it. And at 5 p.m. is his next call. I'm Andy Revkin. I run the Earth Institute initiative on sustainability and communication, which I came to the Earth Institute at Columbia University to start in the fall. And that vision is, how do you make information matter? That's what my core question is. After 35 years of telling stories as a journalist, I think I've stumbled into the reality that storytelling, even effective award-winning storytelling, doesn't always change the world. And facing these risks that are all around us and opportunities too, I think I'm trying to find new paths, many of which involve conversation more than me telling you something that you didn't know before. And so that's why we're here today. Scott, how are you doing, first of all?
Doing okay. I have no health concerns in my family, so I always sort of start with that. So thank you for asking. And my students seem to be doing okay, although I know they're struggling, with the adjusted learning style that we've moved into with the online learning at Drexel. But
Yeah.
We're doing okay in teaching history online. This term we had actually planned teaching a course on Lewis and Clark, actually, with my colleague Tiago Saraiva. And we had really planned a lot of like archives visits. We even had planned like a road trip to Harper's Ferry. So it has forced us to modify some things. But, the historical record also comports itself in some ways pretty well to this kind of learning.
So tell folks a little bit about your vantage point in looking at this pandemic. How you got into the disaster history lens, particularly. There's all kinds of history, war history, and there's all kinds of approaches and philosophies. So, what's the thumbnail sketch of how you became who you are?
I was working on a dissertation about 19th century fires in American cities when September 11 happened. And at that time, I was doing what you'd call history of technology. But what I realized a bit later was that not only was I writing about fires, not just as events, but actually fires as a way to see inside the political economy of 19th century America. But the disasters were revelatory of processes of power that were underway, but also because I was writing, and then the news every day was about what was happening in Lower Manhattan and about the discussions very early in the Bush administration about terrorism, and it sort of took over the rhetoric very early that we might want to investigate what happened in the Twin Towers as fires or as occupational safety health issues or environmental issues in Lower Manhattan. Those parts of the story got written out very quickly as we shifted into a war narrative. And that really interested me and made me start thinking about disaster as its own rubric. And I guess I've been working in that vein ever since. When I first started doing this work, if I identified myself as a disaster historian, I got some very odd looks, I have to tell you. And it was really not seen as a really valid area of research, because most disaster history at that point was like individual books or articles about this flood, that fire, this earthquake. Right. And very rarely did it reveal underlying power structures. And rarely did they try to connect to the events of the day. And so I'm happy to say, well, I don't know if I'm happy to say, I'm sorry we need it, but I'm happy to say that disaster studies, disaster history is now a pretty lively field.
It sure is. I mean, it sure needs to be. Let's put it that way. You know, actually, before we go forward, I have to mention something interesting I didn't know connected us. But um, the last book I did, it came out in 2018, was a history of a history of weather and climate learning journey moments. And
Mhm.
one was this. I was looking around for the worst wildfire, and I thought it had to be in California, or whatever. And it turns out it was in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And it was the same week as the Great Chicago Fire. So no one
Say,
like
yeah.
that shit says a lot about history because our history books have the cow and the fire in Chicago, but they
Totally.
hardly mention this because it wasn't in the city. It wasn't Chicago. Are you familiar with this particular tale?
This is the fire that occurred in the logging camp, basically logging town in Wisconsin in the woods. That same week of the Chicago fire in
Yeah, and there are
1871.
even some enduring theories that they were both sparked by by a celestial event. That there was a meteorite shower or something. It's all kind of wild, but that
Well, they were certainly sparked by a similar climatic moment, which was a period of hot, dry summers and late summers. And there had been multiple fires in Chicago leading up to the so-called Great Fire. But as you point out, I mean, this points to one of the signal challenges in doing any kind of history is
mhm,
that the record is impoverished. I mean, even for events where we think the record is rich, like let's say the Civil War, we're
right.
continually learning new things. And people might ask, well, how can you still be learning something about those events? And the the point of that is that we are asking new questions of the record as it exists, and then we're finding new pieces of the record as we ask. So history is much more alive than people realize, but this making of the archive is an ongoing process. So your discovery of the Wisconsin fire is an important discovery. Now we begin to think of the Chicago fire and the Wisconsin fire in a dialogue. That's an important historical finding.
Yeah, and then today, this gets into the climate work that I've been reporting on for so long because um, anytime you see the word unprecedented
Yeah.
or record, if you're as a journalist or as a member of the public aren't asking in what time frame, then you're not really asking anything meaningful. Like unprecedented doesn't mean anything unless you have a sense of the constraint. Even the great Hurricane Michael, that slammed the panhandle of Florida, the Weather Service office in Tallahassee or somewhere around there said unprecedented in one of its things. But it turned out there are these paleotempestologists, people who study past hurricane patterns by looking at beach sand that gets washed into mud and all kinds of things. So that's not at all unprecedented to have a storm that strong. What was unprecedented was having a community,
Right.
coastal communities that vulnerable, built on a coast in the last 50 years. And actually, in a few minutes, Steve Strader, who's a geographer whose work I've gotten to know, is going to pop in here. I kind of offered an open call for people to come and ask you
Mm-hmm.
questions and talk.
Great.
And Steve's work, it has the hashtag expanding bullseye, is all
Mm-hmm.
about how we obliviously build into areas because we don't understand the history of the hazard, or because we just haven't really fully integrated even what we know about risk into things like zoning or whatever. And that's,
Absolutely.
we were talking a few minutes ago about this current calamity, and you were expressing some pretty dark thoughts about how we've still seem to have failed with all that we do know in a very science based way about risk, the drivers of risk, not just biological, but the other things we face. And yet, how that then gets integrated into decision making or policy still, it's hard to point to clear cases where we got that, what I call the blah 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 bang
Mm-hmm.
kind of rhythm where we averted having that approach. So what does that feel like as a scholar and who's also been very active in conveying learning into doing?
Well, it's extremely humbling, and I think it's we have to take on board the idea that there is no linear path from uh, research science in the humanities, social sciences, or hard sciences related to disaster, there's no clear linear path from that to policy. And even when policy is formed, there's no guarantee that policies will be carried out, or that penalties will be imposed if necessary. I mean, there's so many assumptions about the flow from knowledge to policy to enforcement that we're shown every day have broken down. And I guess in doing these COVID calls over the last almost 2 months now, I've been absolutely blown away by the amount of talent that's out there across disciplines. When we think about disasters as complex systems in and of themselves, we have a lot of resources to work with in terms of people who've done really hard thinking and great work. And yet here we still find ourselves in the middle of this situation in the United States with what has to be the worst managed disaster on record. So how do you explain that? There's a broken link between the knowledge community and the policy community. One would like to think, I'm no conspiracy theorist. I mean, one would like to think that that's just a series of missed opportunities, or we need more time for the evolution of the relationship. But in my darker moments, I feel like there's structural forces out there that are more focused on real estate development than anything else. And that's going to lead the way. And if we have science that shows we shouldn't build in a certain place, that science is inconvenient. If we have social science that tells us we need better regulatory apparatus or inspectors general to tell us when things are going bad inside of an agency, that's inconvenient. So it's swept away. I have to say I've become more of an activist in the last 2 months than I probably have ever been in my entire life, in part because I think we're going to have to become activists for this knowledge. And that's a little uncomfortable for academics often, but I think the time is now or never.
Well, that's a good moment to bring in Steve Strader. So Steve, you're at Villanova.
Yeah, just down the road from Scott.
Hi, Steve. It's nice to meet you.
Right.
Nice to meet you.
And again, I've gotten to know Steve's work through all the writing I've done in the last, long time. Really, your work the last 4 years or so. I've written about tornado risk. I've written about coastal flooding. I've written about all the wildfire risk and climate change at the big scale. And I keep finding that the argument is oblivious to a huge amount of data on where people have built and how they've built, or where they've settled and how they've settled if they're poor, and how that really is the dominant driver still in many places of risk. It's not climate change, it's community change. And it just doesn't seem to sink in, just as Scott was saying, in the context of public health policy around climate. And that it's not just you, it's Lauren Bauer in Europe. He did this big analysis of loss and damage under climate change, which is how countries might get compensated someday, the poor ones. And he basically said, for now, it's the everything we see around us in the loss column from climate impacts is not from climate change. It's from this built vulnerability. And it'll take time even now for that signal from climate change to get out. But we don't seem to want to hear it. So does that resonate what you were just hearing from Scott, this idea that, boy, there's a big gap?
Yeah, one of the first things that popped into my head was this term that we like to use called disaster amnesia, which is, we have very short-sighted memories when it comes to a disaster that occurred in the last decade. In some places with tornadoes, we see a really strong fall off 5 years, less than a decade after the event. People get more relaxed, and the big thing that we see is biases come out, optimism bias. There's a whole list. One of my favorite things to do with my students is to say, go Google search and go find the Wikipedia page about biases, and then to start reading them and looking at how many times we see that with disaster events, disaster response. It's a big issue, and I can't help but think about that disaster amnesia, thinking about all this history of disasters that we've seen. And I wonder, with big events like the COVID issue, how if that's going to hold true. I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But
right.
yeah,
is there a threshold beyond which we suddenly say, "Oh, we really are getting something consistently wrong here"? Maybe we are there. I don't know.
And then the other thing that I'll mention too is just to touch on your other points is the built environment is, all hazards aren't the same. We know more about hot and cold events than we do severe weather events. So we're a little bit better at attributing disasters to one or the other, and it's changing. But you're right. What we're seeing is we're not innocent in this as a society. We're still driving these losses.
So I also had on here on this program recently a couple of people from the intelligence field, Alice Hill, who was a National Security Council under Obama, and Rod Schoonover, who was under both Obama and Trump briefly before he quit last year when Trump tried to constrain his testimony on climate. And Rod had this very interesting observation. He said, he actually wrote the threat assessment, the last one that had pandemic risk, this risk basically delineated very clearly in basic words. But he said it's kind of like on page 21. So I've been calling this the page 21 effect, meaning, and that maybe it's too facile for us grumpy, well, you're not as old as I am, but grumpy men and women, and there are many like Alice who are in the same situation, who, for us to say they're still not getting it, they're still not getting it. Is it that there's more work to be done analytically or using AI or tools that can sort of create a new warning light that hey, this is one of those things we just are going to get wrong. Hello, people. That like a little glowing red light that turns brighter and brighter and orange and red, so that there's just simply no excuse. And when you see that, to get around this page 21 effect, it's fine for Laurie Garrett, who's been on here 2 or 3 times to write prize-winning books about pandemic risk, and Nassim Taleb, who was chiding Cuomo the other day for finally acknowledging he could have acted sooner. And I tweeted kind of angrily at Taleb. He's the Black Swan bestseller author. That maybe there's more work to be done by us. It's too facile to blame the politicians for not listening. And I don't know what that work looks like. I don't know who does that work, which discipline it is, which skill set has to be involved. But it feels like it's not just a why don't they get it kind of flailing of hands thing. I don't know, Scott, what do you think?
Well, I think in the United States we have a unique tradition where we have, if we talk about, let's just talk about standards for a second, safety standards broadly. That's meant to be a participatory endeavor. I mean, we are meant to have multiple different interests represented in those discussions. And so we talk about history of land use in the United States or history of the way our cities are built. We don't have, and we're finding this out right now in a stupendously bad way, we don't have a long tradition of deferring central power to one agency or 2 agencies to carry out this work. We have a wildly diversified set of interests, who private and public-private, who are invited to the table to participate. And at various times in our history, if you look at the solving of the fire problem in cities, for example, that gave rise to a unique system, which is pretty well fitted to the American political economy, which is to say the fire insurance industry played a role, but so did public health, and so did architects, and so did fire protection engineers. There were a lot of voices in the mix. And so that's fine so far as it goes. It's quite different from the way that other countries have handled this, like, say, Japan. But what happens when some of those interests' voices are muted or disappear from the conversation altogether? That's what I worry about, your page 21 effect. So if something is not in the forefront of the sort of disaster paradigm we have in the moment, the sort of dominant disaster we're worried about, it can slip to that page 21, and those competing interests, those discussions are not as vibrant anymore.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen that. I mean, climate change adaptation is a great example of this. In American history, 19th and 20th century, the insurance industry, and I know maybe this is an unpopular thing to say, but the insurance industry has played a major role because of their self-interest in trying to guide the way that development works. I'm not talking about health here, I'm talking about the built environment. But the climate change risk is too great, so they've retreated from the market in lots of places. So there you have a case where now they're not part of that policy discussion. I think Steve knows this better than I do. So when this kind of dance of interests stops in American history, some unexpected risks can pop up. This is quite different from the way Germany or Japan or Singapore, many of the countries that we're looking at right now that have handled the pandemic, I would say, pretty well. South Korea, they just manage them differently, more in line with their own political economy. That's why I would argue that if we don't have history and political economy built into our understanding of how these disaster plans come to be, we are completely at a loss because we can't explain how we got here.
And Steve, maybe let's talk about tornadoes just a little bit in this context, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Because, it's one of these areas that's so glaring and so consistently disastrous, meaning and tragic, to see communities sprouting in areas where and it's people who know the tornado history, and with or without climate change,
Yeah.
that we're building. And that paper, you did a paper in like 2016 that just was one of the scariest things I read. Maybe it was more recent, 2018, that projected
Oh, yeah.
how many factor. It wasn't an order of magnitude, but it was like many times increase in
Yeah.
risk coming, absolutely,
Yeah.
period, in these areas. And it's like, so just play that out a little bit in the context of
Yeah.
where do we
Yeah.
go?
So, right now our knowledge on the climate change front is with tornadoes particularly is really limited. There's a handful of us that are out there doing that and colleagues of mine, but it takes a long time. We're talking years to run these models to that scale, to the storm scale. So we're just now starting to see results come from that in the last, decade. So we're behind a little bit in the severe convective weather world when it comes to impacts, or when it comes to climate change, I should say. However, when we look at that disaster side of things, we have this issue once again staring us right in the face, and it's that built environment, that human built environment that's growing and expanding. And what we've found over the last few years is looking into the future. Yes, even if we're looking at the worst case scenario with a doubling of tornadoes, which we don't expect to see, or we're seeing this longer season, the effects of a expanding built environment are rapidly increasing. 4 times as many important factors that go into that built environment issue.
Right.
So we ask the question: how do people protect themselves now, and how can they continue to protect themselves in the future? And that becomes a very convoluted question, because we're now not dealing with just homes; we're dealing with decision making, people. So a physical scientist like myself has partnered strongly with social scientists as well as engineers to help get at this issue.
Can I throw something onto that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to attend a meeting of meteorologists and people in the tornado community in Oklahoma City. I mean, we went to the weather center, and I was there with some colleagues of mine, Vivian Choi and Kim Fortune and a few others, and we were there to represent social science. It was quite an extraordinary gathering and meeting, and I really hand it to the organizers for trying to seed that conversation. There was a moment I will never forget in the conversation in which I raised, I'm always the least popular person at these things. I said, well, what about your building standards, and what about shelters, and what about actually focusing less on prediction and focusing more on just changing the building code so you don't have as many temporary structures, as much debris flying around, or that you would mandate. This was right after the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes, so maybe you should mandate safe spaces. And I mean, you could have heard pen drop, because that is different work, number one, from the work that community has spent so much time trying to do. And even their work on warning, which is hugely innovative and important, it just seems that you can give people as much warning as possible. If they don't have somewhere safe to go, some percentage of them are going to die in these tornadoes.
For sure.
And that, to me, really showed the missing gap, which was really to talk about the economy of Oklahoma in this case, and to talk about the value of a piece of property, the value and the added cost, the way it's often explained around fire sprinklers, for example. Why don't we have fire sprinklers required in every home in America? we can drive deaths in home fires down to almost zero if we had that. But the National Association of Home Builders tells us that adds, and it varies on the state, but some measurable percentage to all new housing starts. And the minute that hits the state house, it kills the discussion. Only 2 states have required sprinklers, fire sprinklers in homes. And I don't know, Steve, what the story is with tornado shelters. I know there was an Oklahoma governor's race that almost hinged on that question, and it broke down on this exact thing: too expensive to make this a requirement. So we just accept the risk.
Yeah.
Well, and think about that in the context of all these arguments about coronavirus right now. It's the same thing. You know, I remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, a constructive libertarian and I were going back and forth on Twitter about a pretty open, good question, which is how many hospital beds is the right number of hospital beds per 1,000 people in a country? And Japan is like 12 or 13. We're at 2.8. But you know, what's the right number is actually an open question. And we're making those judgments all the time in a way. They're mostly, as you say, unspoken. They're kind of like, they're not put in that context. How many ICU beds? You know, it's a whole nother question. Or what level of protection? How safe should an airplane be? You know, certain things get our attention more than others. I've written about airplane crashes too, and sometimes we're not logical even in how we make those decisions. So it feels like there's a lot of work to be done. But you know, maybe it's just every day that's just the way we're going to be having to deal with these things.
But the differences, Andy, I think are important, and this is an important research question for us because they do vary in different countries according to the legal structure and the political economy. So in the United States, I'm not surprised by that number you put out, because in the United States, we tend to not take a precautionary principle. This is true in the built environment. I think it's true in the medical environment. We tend to allow risk-taking, which is sometimes called innovation. We celebrate that in American history. And if things go wrong, we litigate on the other side. Whereas in a country like Japan or Germany, there's a lot more precaution that goes in on the front end of the creation of policies. And, you know, I think that's often discussed in the United States as a impossible regulatory environment. And if we can just get regulation out of the way, then we can liberate the economy. But I always think, well, those regulations are not just like some body from the EPA telling you to do something. They come down to these very questions you're talking about. How many tornado shelters must there be? How many hospital beds do we need? I mean, that's the granular stuff of this kind of disaster regulation that's important, but there's no international best practice, I don't think. It's wildly variable across different countries.
And it's culturally variable. There's many drivers of that. Maybe talk about the history part of this a little bit more in that context too. You know, I was thinking a lot about South Korea, the responsiveness there, and Taiwan to the coronavirus epidemic. And I've been in both countries, and you know, they're both basically on a wartime footing all the time as well. So that, like, they're like miles away from Armageddon. And how much of that shapes their decisions about hospital beds, or even citizens' decisions about how compliant to be, along with other questions about culture. So culture, historically, Scott, you know, how far back do you need to go to get some clarity on if you wanted to drive decision-making in a particular place?
I think to me, that's a tremendous question, because it forces us to really think about the temporal boundaries that we operate with. In other words, how far back do we need to go to learn lessons from history? And I think it's different in different cases. You know, if you want to talk, to what Steve's an expert in, you want to talk about the built environment, you want to talk about climate change and sea level rise, we might have to go back a couple hundred years to understand why things are built the way they are. I'm just working on an essay now with a colleague named Ashley Rogers, who she's the director of the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, a tremendous place. And she can talk about how the history of slavery connects to the way the petrochemical industry actually looks down there. So if you want to understand disaster in Cancer Alley, you got to go pretty far back. To your question about South Korea, though, yeah, I mean, a lot of their disaster practices right now have been through revision just since 2014 because of the Sewol ferry disaster.
Oh yeah, good point.
Against a backdrop of the Korean War and against a backdrop of their move out of an authoritarian military regime in the 1980s and into a democracy, they've had an incredibly volatile 75 years. And so that's a much nearer term history that does give us some insight, I think, into the way these policies develop. I had on COVID calls, I had a couple of guests who spoke about that, and they talked about the MERS outbreak in South Korea a few years ago. And if you look at the MERS outbreak and the fallout from the Sewol ferry, and the president who was of South Korea during the Sewol ferry is in prison right now, that's a very recent historical frame. So I don't think I can prescribe one frame. I think we have to be able to be adaptable and understand some cases we need to go back much deeper. In other cases, nearer term cases can be very useful for us.
That reminds me of Patrick Keyes, who was on here earlier, maybe 3 weeks ago. It seems like an eternity at Colorado State. He wrote a really important paper recently on Anthropocene risk. And he's a geographer also. And it was all about the need to go back in time to get the deeper contexts before you make a judgment about a current risk in the Anthropocene, that there's so much complexity and layering, whether you're looking at water stress in the Middle East and you're not thinking about water policy or farm policy in Iraq, you're missing big drivers that just aren't there on the surface, which is, again, sort of like my paleoclimatologist friends. Their work is so vital to framing, along with the geographers, on the built environment that's at risk. It's the paleoclimate people who I did a story in 2009 out of Ghana. I didn't go to Ghana, but it was a really important paper from a lake there that showed that region, it's normal to have 100-year mega droughts there. There just hasn't been one in modern history, but in the last several thousand years, there have been a number of them, and they're actually not easy to understand. So if you don't know that, then everything looks like climate change, as opposed, cut CO2 to save water, to have water security in Ghana is not correct unless you're thinking bigger. So here we go again. So, Steve, I was at a meeting on, it was called Understand Risk. It was a periodic meeting of the World Bank and others put on. And I was in a session on volcanoes and communication. And I remember I reached out to you via Twitter. And because you had done that study in the Seattle area showing again how much building has gone on around volcanoes that are simmering time bombs, with all kinds of questions around that. And I think one of the things that you said, you were pretty candid at the time, saying that your field, the geography, hadn't yet, at least at that time, a couple of years ago, integrated. You didn't feel like you were part of the conversation on that, the big judgments about risk and stuff. So how much of this is about just getting more people into rooms in meaningful ways? Like Scott, actually, you kind of mentioned that concept.
Yeah. Well, I think a big problem. One thing that I kept thinking about with policy is not just the volcano issue, but I think a lot about the manufactured housing industry. If we bring it back to tornadoes too, is we see policies that were shaped in recent, certainly in my lifetime with Hurricane Andrew, where we talked about how we're tying the manufactured homes to the surface of the earth and keeping them coupled and from getting essentially blown away. And in 1992, we made changes to the HUD code. Unfortunately, even though that happened and that's relatively recent, what we're finding out now is that's largely ineffective and useless in the tornado world. And what we find is inevitably decision making and people's knowledge of what is required by law is perfectly legal, but it's not necessarily making any sense to us from a disaster safety standpoint. It's not building resilience. We don't have homes that meet any really strong standards that keep them safer in these tornado situations. So what we see is, and this is akin to the volcano issue, is building construction, siting of homes, and the location we're building are sort of separate from our scientists. The decision to make money is much bigger priority. And where we've had success at changing the opinions is when we all can get in the room and we talk with housing industries and we talk with different developers and we say, this is what we're seeing. They don't want any liability at all. It's just a very difficult thing to do because unfortunately economics are driving everything. If you can make money building your home here, then they're gonna allow it. It's what it feels like. We're not quite there yet, but it's an uphill battle, but we're still walking up the hill.
And that, as you said, that power of the status quo decision-making process, of the outsized influence of real-time politics is
Yeah.
a very powerful inertial force. And the path dependency of the norms by which those policies are made is also there as well. That's all part of history too, is back to Scott's discipline.
Yeah.
Scott, you were developing some kind of a working group on Twitter, I think, around. I think it's a little bit related to this, right? Like, how do we break through here a little bit? Could you talk about that if I have this right? I'm vaguely remembering right now. There's a team of people who are getting more engaged.
Well, I think so I'm involved with several different, I think, attempts at this. Some of them are grant funded, and some of them are a little bit more spontaneous or organic. I've actually been hoping that we could have the formation of something that approximated a union of concerned scientists, but for disasters.
Right.
And so that it actually departed from you look at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they began with sort of an activist core, which is that, science was being either ignored or put to the wrong ends. And I worry about this a lot, that if we you think about states where there's a lot of risk, like California or North Carolina, Texas, and you have these big state schools that have enormous potential in science research, and then they continue to condone policies that allow for the expansion of risk. What kind of strange relationship is that? The wealth of the state is enhanced by the development of the real estate, and then part of that wealth goes back into the science complex of the state's ability to understand the risk they're creating. It's a vicious cycle. And I think we have to break it. And so I think a union of concerned disaster scientists is just one idea you could put out there, that you sort of stake a flag and you say, look, we're not saying that we want the economy to tank. We're saying that there's ways to do development, or there's ways to provide healthcare, or there's ways to deal with a pandemic in which you don't have to force people whether or not you want to save a life or wreck your economy. I mean, this kind of false choice that we've been forced with by the Trump administration around this pandemic is example A of this. But I think Steve would agree. I mean, people who do this kind of research, we see this every single day. Well, we can't do climate change adaptation. It will bankrupt this county. I've heard that so many different times. So I don't think we reject that choice. Though I think some sort of coming together of disaster scientists across disciplines who could actually articulate clearly that we reject that choice is important. The other thing I would add to that, Andy, is that I have been lucky also in my research. I'm always looking for those people who do span, who are experts in their field, but who also engage in the policy process and who engage with journalists. Somebody like Max Moritz comes to mind, for example. He's a fire scientist out in California. He's a tremendous scientist in his own right, but at the same time, he has put so much effort into creating science that can then be engaged in public. Like, he goes to town hall meetings. I mean, he walks the walk. And if necessary, he lobbies. He does the hard work, and he sits down with insurance companies as well. And I think that kind of a model is really important. Howard Conrather is a good example of this. He's a risk scientist at the Wharton School. His whole career has been focused on doing this kind of work that spans. It's legitimate science on its own, but he also has developed, I think, these unique skills and relationships. This is crucial in America, where this divide between the sort of academic community and the development community has become too great. I think if we need to invest anywhere, I'd be investing in developing those kinds of skills. But I don't think it means we have to back away from a core principle that human life and quality of life should come first, and that profit can be connected with that, but that profit can't be put first. And every single day now, I hear this choice being forced on us around the pandemic, and I think we just have to call it out.
Yeah.
That sounds
Yeah,
fair.
I guess I think the thing that it popped in my head immediately with what Scott said, again, I think about sort of my own purview of this is looking at manufactured homes, and what we're finding is if you make your manufactured home in Alabama rated to what a manufactured home is in Florida, it's pennies on the dollar when you buy the home to do that, but they're not aware of that, making that decision. And we find is when we've talked to these mobile manufactured home residents, they would make that decision. They just were not aware of it. But you're talking less than $1,000 to say your home can now withstand a much higher rated or more intense tornado, and your safety in your life is going to be much better off if you're hit by one. And they say, yeah, I'll spend pennies on the dollar to do this. So it is an interesting aspect. And I even think about it in the practical sense that, yeah, people should do that, and it's worth it. It's worth our time.
No, I've seen this in the wildfire arena hugely.
Exactly.
And what's interesting there too is it's like Headwaters Economics, whose insights I value hugely, is basically free market. You know, they're not liberal conservative. They're about limited regulation and the like. But they've done all these analyses, like this one that found negligible cost differences between a typical home and a home constructed using wildfire resistant materials and design features. And so it's the same thing. This is why, I mean, I shouldn't use the word excited, but I do get excited because this is a communication.
Yeah.
Some of this is communication. It's not all money. You know, it's like the financial norms and lobbying power that's got this inertial power that's locked into an old mode of economics is a big issue. But when you look with a basic economic frame at some of this stuff, it's a no-brainer. And yet, and yet, it's still this same challenge you're all talking about. So I still think, I do like Scott's idea of, let's get into gear on this. It feels like there's a lot to get into gear on. I created this was years ago on .earth, my blog at the Times. I created a poster, only you can live with wildfire. Changing the framing around, if you're going to live in the Southeast and you're not actively, daily making decisions based on the reality of tornadoes, then you're setting yourself up for big oops and tragedy. And in wildfire country, if anything, it's even more glaring. And the politics is still, Gavin Newsom was resisting. The LA Times punished him. This is before the coronavirus, but for resisting anything that smacked of limiting development in forest areas in California. And you can't yell climate change on one side, and say we're not going to change the way California is built in wildfire zones. Another guy, Michael Mann, not the famous Michael Mann climate scientist, but another Michael Mann geographer, climate scientist, did a paper on the building in California in zones that are already marked high wildfire severity. And it's like, several 100,000 homes are slated to be built in the next 30 years in places that are already red zones. So it's a huge task. I do think there's stuff to do. So we should keep at this. Let's put it that way. So let's see if any more questions have come in. It's good. My little test here has not generated a lot of people popping into the queue here to come online. Let me get rid of this thing. So, what would be, I want to circle back to where we are right now. And I do like to, every time I do this show, I like to acknowledge the people who are most at risk right now. We're all around us, stocking shelves and cleaning hospitals and doing the more direct tasks at risk. So I think it's worth circling back to coronavirus one more time and thinking about history. And Scott, I guess to you first, the idea of tell us a little bit about what you've learned in how many COVID calls? Another one
Yeah,
coming at 5, and you could maybe say who's coming on at 5.
sure. Today's the 38th COVID call. People can find those on SoundCloud. The COVID calls that I can find on YouTube. Just look for me or look for COVID calls and you'll find them. They're all archived there. My guest today is Chuck Strozier. Chuck's a historian and a psychotherapist and has written on many different topics. He wrote a book about 9/11. He's written about the apocalyptic. We're going to talk today about disaster denial, risk denial, about the role of imagination, the role of healing. To your question about history, I mean, the question I have been asked most frequently in these last couple months, and that I've been asking other historians, is, what lessons or what can you pull from the archive, the human archive, to help us in this moment? And I think there are some, I've talked to people like Patrick Roberts, for example, who's an expert on the history of FEMA, or Andy Lakoff, who's an expert on pandemic preparedness. We learn very important, I think, often quite specific lessons about the development of the United States bureaucracy and legal structure, which does help us understand how we got to this moment in time, and how we ended up with the agencies that we did, the responsibilities that they have, and how they failed, and what they might do to reverse course. And yet, I still feel like, and I think there have been some important lessons that should have been understood much more clearly early on about the 1918 pandemic and the role of sheltering, the role of what we might call surveillance, the importance of supporting the press in this moment and being transparent about findings and not hiding findings and things like that. But I guess, at the same time, Andy, there's also been for me, a kind of surprising role for history, and just speak personally, which is also as a sort of reservoir of understanding the human condition. That less of thinking about history as a set of facts and data points that we can then plug and play into this particular moment, but to actually think more about historical moments like the 1918 pandemic or the 1968 pandemic, which was in Asia, was striking Vietnam in the middle of the Vietnam War, and soldiers brought that home to the United States. How people coped in those moments, how people made sense of that moment, how they protested in those moments, the anger, the emotions that they felt. I think a lot of us, speak personally, are just struggling with a lot of anger right now. A lot of expectations I had about the way that knowledge should perform in a democracy. And I'm not the first person to feel those things. Yeah. History is also serving a role for me, and I think for many others in this moment, not just as a clearinghouse for facts, but also as a reservoir of understanding.
It's true. And you're reminding me a little bit of, like you jumped in to create COVID calls, the Seamus Khan, who's the chairman of sociology department at Columbia. This is like a month ago now. He, among other things, he launched with others, a website called youthremote.learning.com, which was a bunch of classes that people could teach who were stuck at home to kids who were stuck at home. And the one he launched, I'm just looking for the website, it's a class in how to be an ethnographer as a high school or junior high school student, how to look at the world around you right now as it's unfolding. Chronocentrism is a property that's, I think it was Stuart Hart at Cornell spoke about this once, and he told the audience that every generation thinks it's special, but this is a freaking special time. Like, so get out and document it and nail it down from your standpoint as you are as a young student or whatever, and that, grappling with that, engaging with that, conveying that information in a way that future generations can understand. It seems like a good way to get past some of the paralysis and confusion, perhaps.
It's one of the ways.
Like that idea.
Yeah. It's one of the ways that historians have taken action right now in this moment. There are many different efforts right now. I mean, at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, Valerie Marlowe is leading an effort at archiving, like taking archiving of this moment seriously. we make a lot of assumptions in the digital world that all this stuff's going to be here for us 2 years later or 5 years later when we come back, and I can't find some of my own publications. It's like, so we shouldn't assume that the archive will be full just because we can bring up a world of materials right now in front of us. And there are some tremendous projects underway. Ryan Hagen is leading one at Columbia University in New York. These sort of real-time ethnographic archiving, oral history projects. We've never done something like that here. I'm a historian, we'll say unprecedented. I can't think of examples where we've tried to do this kind of work in this distance format, this way we're doing things right now. That's a moment of learning and how to treat research subjects fairly, how to use all of the things we know we need to use in terms of mutual aid and clarity of purpose when we do our work and ethics. We're working those out in real time, but yeah, I think that there's a role for history, not just again to dredge up the past, but also to make sense of this time we're living in right now and try to record it going forward.
I agree. And it's funny, I'm looking on their page. Let me show this again. So this is youthremote.learning.com. And I don't see any courses in the history topic, in the history category. So maybe there's one to build there. Nothing found here.
No history found. Well, I'm sure they can. I'm sure they can address that.
No, I think it's great to think of everyone engaging some way or other. By the way, I love what Carter Brooks just posted as a comment here. If you just to make sure people can see it. As they say, those who study history are doomed to watch other people repeat it. I assume that's an old saw for those who are historians. That's the first time I've heard that framing. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Funny, sort of. Haha. What a tough moment. We have a few more minutes, so maybe we'll focus on that idea of a to-do list. Obviously, that notion of a union of concerned disaster scientists. One way to reframe it is resilience scientists. Is resilience the opposite of disaster risk? Obviously, there's many other things, but are there other ways to frame this that might captivate people who resist the warning frame? Oh, that's good. That's a good sign. Maybe that. Where it's more an opportunity frame. As I said with blah 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 bang, my perennial worry about unheard messages. It's clear that one doesn't work. The Cassandra conundrum, call it. So does this get back at that? Is that part of the task? Are we stuck asking the wrong question? Avoiding disaster, mitigating disaster. Is that the wrong frame?
Maybe. We get into these metaphors and frames very easily. Describing the pandemic as a war happened almost immediately. That's dangerous, I think. But it's a way people have made sense of what we're living through right now. I have my own quibbles with resilience because I often feel like resilience is handled ahistorically with no attention to vulnerable populations. It's like a condition that we will all achieve. But I'm okay with talking about that and arguing about that because there's a lot of great resilience work that's out there. I just wish there was more history in it. I don't know. To me, democracy works just fine. Let's work towards democracy. And what does democracy of risk look like? What does disaster management in a real democracy look like? I think we can think about that. We have plenty of history to look at that around the world. Or you can ask the obvious inverse of that. What does disaster under authoritarianism look like? And maybe we're getting a little glimpse of that in the United States in unexpected ways right now. But I think imagining how to respond to disaster in the context of democracy to me seems like a good frame and one that's very inviting, should be.
Although that does lead back to questions about, are we even in a democracy, with the way our political structures.
But I like that because then the question about disaster is not separate from the broader question that we're all asking right now. And disaster shouldn't ever be separate from the lived experience of our world right now. I wouldn't segregate it from that bigger question. In fact, I think we don't ask that question enough, Andy.
I'm with you on that. In fact, many people who think about climate change all the time, many of my friends who are climate campaigners, when it really comes down to is the structures in our politics are always going to cut against climate action, climate change, decarbonization particularly. It's so the power structures in Congress and the like are so powerful and so stuck. And everyone keeps coming at this, oh, here's the Green New Deal, or here's this. And they throw it at that structure. And of course, it breaks or dissolves or gets reduced to something meaningless. And if you still think it's a climate problem, you're missing something. Although, actually, your Drexel colleague, former Drexel colleague, Robert Bruhl, wrote this pretty epic paper with Carrie Norgard on what they call social inertia. And I'm just going to add this here as a comment. There's a link that goes to it. I did a shortcut, j.mp/social inertia. And basically, Bob Bruhl's argument is that when you're confronting a big risk and you realize that the change that would have to happen is so contrary to your understanding of social norms and the structures around you, you get paralyzed. It kills your initiative right when it should engage you and make you more empowered, seeking more empowerment. And that's kind of a discouraging thought, but it really is a systems. If you really want to go at this in a systematic way, you have to grapple with that reality. I don't know. Or are we stuck?
One of the first classes I ever taught at Drexel was a big seminar on climate change. It was multi-faculty taught, and Bruhl was one of the instructors. And it's the only class I ever taught at Drexel where it was standing room only. And Bruhl at that time was working, had a huge list of speeches. He had all these speeches, and he was using early text recognition software to pull certain keywords out of those political speeches. I mean, he's been at this for such a long time. I learned so much from him in that regard. And Bruhl has always taken very seriously, I think, some of the things we're talking about right now, which is that your science can be stellar, but if your communication strategy doesn't take into account the way people receive messages in this country, you're not going to get there.
Yeah.
I don't know, Steve, I mean, you're doing the same thing with risk communication in your work, right?
Yeah, I mean, this week is Hurricane Preparedness Week, and we're already talking about, I think, the big concern in the next few months, and actually even today. I mean, we're in a bit of a down pattern in terms of severe weather, but there's more than one group out there, and myself included. We're asking, what do we do with sheltering and evacuation in the COVID age? I mean, what are we going to do? Tornadoes, severe weather is a we've had some issues with telling people, do they go to community shelters or do they stay home? And it's different county to county. And National Weather Service, NOAA, FEMA, there's some debate about what the right message is. And then now multiply that times 100 and you're dealing with tropical storms. And it's looking like season might get a head start. And it's a bit concerning. And I don't know what the right answer is. And I think that's where the dialogue has to be open, like you said. So it's a bit concerning for me. And, you talk about being angry and frustrated. Part of it is just fear of the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. And I think getting folks to listen to science is getting hard, and it's been hard, and it's going to continue to be difficult. So it's something that's very forefront on my mind in terms of looking at the risk communication. What I think is good and what I think is bad is different than everybody else. So that makes it very challenging, and you can lead to some pessimistic views. I'll tell you that much. Sort of like hands in the air, right? What do we do?
Well, yeah, and this we have to come to an end here, but of course, this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the end. Like the American Geophysical Union, I really think there's a lot to say in their Thriving Earth Exchange program, which is designed to give earth scientists and communities a way to find each other when they have a challenge, whether it's chronic flooding or landslide risk or whatever. And so I'm putting up here Thriving Earth Exchange. And what it is about is building a sustained interface between scientific expertise and community needs.
Mhm.
So it's not like scientists coming in saying blah blah blah, and then the bang happens. It's a conversation. It gets around the rough edges of the political framing because people are in the same room frequently. This is I heard the same thing at a big meeting at Columbia last year on managed retreat. The communities that are grappling more effectively with how to resolve having a shoreline that's going to be changing basically forever in the next 100 years and beyond. The only way, the places that get progress is where there's a sustained relationship and conversation between expertise and the community. It's not like some one-time thing or a big report or the like. So I think those models are important. How do you scale that is a huge question. Thousands of communities need to have these conversations. The Jefferson Center in the Midwest is doing rural climate dialogues, rural energy dialogues. Maybe they should do rural resilience dialogues
Mhm.
that are the model of citizen juries. Where you're all there. It's almost like a Quaker kind of thing. And I think let's just say that let's all agree to work on this a little bit more. And
Mhm.
I thank you for those who've been listening today. If you have been listening, share this program with others. And you guys and me and the others we all know in this field I really would like to dig in more on that union of concerned scientists, communicators, practitioners. It's not just scientists. It's getting people in the room to hash forward some of the things that need to happen would be great. So Scott Knowles, you got to get ready for your 5 o'clock session.
Yeah.
Steve Strader, good luck sustaining support for your incredibly important work with Ashley
Thank
Walker
you.
and others. And again, for the people listening, thank you for being here. This is Sustain What? It's a frequent conversation around how do we make information matter in a fast forward planet facing multi-layered risk and opportunity. The focus for the time being is COVID-19, but we're getting into all the related issues as you can imagine going forward. They're all intertwined. Tomorrow, we're doing a big session on food, climate, and coronavirus with some of my colleagues at the Earth Institute who are focused in Guatemala and Ethiopia and other countries around the tropical belt on food resilience, food security in a changing climate, and now with the coronavirus. And Sunday, as always, we'll be doing one of my kickback sessions that's mainly music and poetry. Sunday, 10:30 to 12:30. The one tomorrow will be at 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. Eastern, and going forward many more. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you particularly to Scott and to Steve.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Andy. These are great conversations. Thanks.
Thank you.